All right, listen up, network defenders. This is a Code Ninja security advisory. We're totally bypassing the standard update cycle today because, well, we've got a critical active zero-day threat on our hands. We're looking at live in-the-wild exploitation targeting SonicWall SMA1000 appliances. If your perimeter relies on these specific secure mobile access gateways, consider this explainer your immediate action plan. You know, the standard patching lifecycle just goes right out the window when a threat of this magnitude hits the wire. Our objective today is simple. We're going to break down exactly how this hijack works, hand you the telemetry you need to hunt for active compromise, and frankly, force some immediate mitigation.
Now, the absolute most crucial point here is that CVSS severity score of 10.0. If you track vulnerabilities, you already know 10.0 is literally the ceiling. It signifies a catastrophic failure in access control. Specifically, we're talking about an unauthenticated server-side request forgery, or SSRF. So what does that actually mean for you? It means threat actors don't need stolen credentials, they don't need an inside man, and they definitely don't need to phish your employees. An external, completely unauthenticated attacker can just bypass your perimeter defenses and achieve full system takeover. When a 10.0 drops like this, it is absolutely an all-hands-on-deck scenario.
And the incident timeline really reveals exactly how severe this situation is. Look at this. On July 14, 2026, the vulnerability was publicly disclosed. On that exact same day, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, bypassed their standard review periods and immediately slammed this into their known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. And it didn't stop there. CISA mandated an incredibly aggressive, highly compressed 72-hour federal mitigation deadline of July 17, 2026. Guys, they do not do this for theoretical bugs. They do this because threat actors are actively leveraging these 0 days to compromise critical infrastructure right this second.
Okay, before we dive into the technical dissection of this attack, let's pause for a quick tactical comms check. In a rapidly evolving zero-day scenario like this, real-time intelligence is literally your best defense. So I need you to establish a secure communication link with this channel right now. Hit subscribe to @cybertech79 and make sure your notifications are active so you don't miss our emergency advisories. Also, drop a like on this explainer right now. Consider that a formal acknowledgement, an act, if you will, that you have successfully received this critical intel.
All right, Section 1. Let's assess the blast radius and figure out exactly who is at risk here.
In any incident response scenario, your very first step is triage, right? You need to know exactly which systems represent an immediate threat to your network and which ones let you breathe a sigh of relief. Since we're dealing with catastrophic unauthenticated remote code execution and authentication bypass, identifying vulnerable assets in your stack is priority number 1. So let's look at the breakdown. The vulnerable hardware consists of the SonicWall SMA6210, the SMA7210, and the SMA8200V running the SMA1000 workplace interface. If you've got these racked in your data center, they are prime targets. But hey, precision is key in threat intel. Explicitly, this 0-day does not affect SonicWall firewalls running SSL VPN, and it doesn't affect the SMA100 series appliances either. So if your perimeter is built on the unaffected SSL VPN or 100 series, you can stand down. But if you're running those vulnerable models, well, it's time to get to work.
Moving on to Section 2, the Exploit Chain Protocol, SSRF to root.
So how exactly are attackers breaking into these boxes? Well, they aren't just using a single bug, they're actually chaining two specific vulnerabilities, CVE 2026-15409 and CVE 2026-15410, to create a unified exploit protocol. We practice coordinated vulnerability disclosure specifically to understand these mechanics so we can build robust defenses. And let me tell you, this attack path is linear and devastatingly effective. It's a 3-phase operation. Step 1 is the initial external breach, an SSRF pivot through a specific web proxy endpoint. Step 2 leverages that pivot to achieve remote code execution inside an internal subsystem. And finally, Step 3 takes that localized execution and escalates it to absolute root privilege across the entire appliance. Let's break down each step.
The sheer elegance of this initial pivot is honestly what makes it so dangerous. This is CVE 2026-14549. The attacker targets the public-facing wsproxy endpoint over standard HTTPS on port 443. The flaw is actually in how the appliance handles a specific parameter called BMID. By manipulating this BMID parameter, so it starts with -3389 and then feeding it a payload of host equals 127.0.0.1 and port equals 1050, the attacker completely tricks the SonicWall appliance into tunneling their external web traffic directly into the internal protected network segment. Specifically, they're routing themselves right to an internal Erlang distribution service.
And once the attacker is tunneled into that internal Erlang node, they hit a fatal architectural flaw. See, the internal Erlang service is secured by a cookie, but it's a hard-coded default. That string, starting with 10acad5b, is identical across all these vulnerable deployments. Because the attacker already knows this secret key, they can just seamlessly authenticate to the internal node. And once they're authenticated, Erlang's native functionality allows them to issue the os.cmd/1 call. That function essentially passes whatever the attacker wants directly to the underlying operating system. Boom! At this point, the attacker has unauthenticated remote code execution.
But as we know, an advanced persistent threat doesn't just want basic code execution, they want the keys to the kingdom. Enter Step 3, CVE 2026-15-410. Using their newfound access, the attacker writes a malicious shell script to the appliance's temporary directory /var-tmp/. Then they trigger a path traversal payload through the appliance management console, specifically hitting the remove hotfix XML RPC endpoint. By injecting a specific directory traversal string, they force the system to execute their planted script with absolute root privileges. The kill chain is complete. Your perimeter is fully compromised.
All right, Section 3, Compromise Assessment and Remediation.
Understanding the attack is really only half the battle. Now we've got to shift to defensive operations. Because this vulnerability has been actively exploited in the wild, you absolutely cannot assume your network is safe just because you haven't noticed anything broken. You must proactively hunt for active compromise before you apply any patches. Think about it. If you patch a compromised system without evicting the attacker first, you're literally just locking the back door with the adversary already inside your house. So here are your direct hunting orders. Pull and urgently review your telemetry for these specific artifacts. First, check your extraweb-access.log. You're looking for requests to wsproxy that return an HTTP 101 status code. That indicates a successful WebSocket tunnel was established using those suspicious host parameters we just talked about. Next, scan that same log for unexpected 200 status hits to the API login or logout endpoints. Then, check controlservice.log for any evidence of hotfix rollbacks containing path traversal strings. That's your root escalation payload right there. Finally, audit your var-lib unitconf.json file to see if the attacker has hard-coded any unauthorized API routes to maintain persistence. Now, if your logs are completely clean, your immediate next step is remediation. SonicWall has issued mandatory firmware upgrades. You need to update your SMA1000 appliances immediately to either version 12.4.3-03453 and above, or 12.5.0-02835 and above. But I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. Simply patching is not enough if your compromise assessment turned up positive hits. If you are breached, you have to initiate full incident response protocols. That likely means wiping the appliance, revoking all current VPN credentials, and rebuilding from a known clean state before you even think about applying this firmware.
For the security researchers and penetration testers actively defending these environments out there, the community has already analyzed the proof-of-concept tools available. And yeah, there is a fully weaponized Python exploit framework circulating right now that automatically chains the SSRF to root privilege escalation, complete with interactive shells and mass scanning capabilities. However, a safe detection script, checker.py, is also available. I strongly urge defenders to use the -detect flag on these tools. Using that flag allows for safe, authorized vulnerability verification. It confirms the SSRF exists without actually pulling the trigger on the weaponized remote code execution.
Which brings us to Section 4, Ethics and Sign-Off.
This brings us to a really foundational principle of the White Hat community. We dissect these exploits not to cause harm, but to understand the adversary and fortify our defenses. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure is an absolutely essential mechanism. By bringing these severe flaws out of the shadows, we force vendors to issue critical fixes, and we equip defenders with the knowledge they need to protect their infrastructure. Let this quote be your guiding directive. Users need to know to protect their systems. Transparency is what protects the perimeter. However, make no mistake, the tools and techniques we've discussed today are incredibly dangerous. They must be utilized strictly for authorized testing. Operating these frameworks without explicit, written permission from the system owner is a direct violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and it carries severe legal consequences. Remember,
We are here to secure networks, not exploit them.
And that concludes this Code Ninja security advisory on the SonicWall SMA1000 0-day. Patch your systems, check your logs, and never, ever assume your perimeter is impenetrable. I'll leave you with this one final thought. Are your perimeters truly locked down right now, or is there a blind spot sitting in your rack just waiting to be exploited? Evaluate your patching cadence, audit your edge devices, and as always, stay secure.